everyone, it is Jazz here. Today I am doing my March reading wrap-up. I read 5 books in the month of March, and I also had a book that I decided to DNF, but I kind of wanted to talk about the reasons why I didn't finish it. Let's just jump in. The first book that I completed in the month of March was a reread of the book The Looking Glass Wars by Frank Badoer, which is the first book in the Looking Glass Wars trilogy. This book is a YA fantasy sort of steampunk reimagining of Alice in Wonderland. It centers around the premise that Alice was the princess of Wonderland and the heir to the throne, and as a child she kind of had to escape Wonderland because her Aunt Red, or the Red Queen as we know her, decided to attack, and so she jumps into the pool of tears, kind of ends up crossing worlds into our world and ends up lost and alone in Victorian London. During that time, she meets Charles Dodson, aka Lewis Carroll, and he writes a book about her. Also during this time, her bodyguard, Hatter Madigan, aka the Mad Hatter, has been on the search for her for several years so that Alice can reclaim the Wonderland throne. This is definitely one of my favorite series, and it's kind of surprising because I'm not the hugest fan of Alice in Wonderland, but I do really love this reimagining of it. Now, I do think it's really important to go into this book with an open mind, because when you think about it, the general premise of this is that everything that you read in the book Alice in Wonderland is wrong. Now, I think if you can go into it with an open mind, you'll definitely find things that are nice parallels between the original literature and also find things that you like about it. If you do decide to pick this up, do keep an open mind about what the author is kind of trying to do with the story. I have so many things that I really enjoy about the story. It is extremely action-packed. Everything really propels into the next thing. There's not a lot of like dead moments in this book. And it also has a kind of cool sense of humor, because it kind of has a sense of humor that's really similar to something like The Princess Bride. So if you like The Princess Bride, you probably will enjoy the humor that is expressed in this. The world building elements in this are really fun. It, of course, mixes in some things from the Alice in Wonderland book, but kind of turns them on their head. But also, in this book, instead of magic, the characters use something called imagination. And imagination does kind of work like magic. Like, they can conjure things out of nothing or, like, use it as a weapon. Also, in terms of the world building, there are cool things like different kinds of machinery and weapons that are kind of that steampunk element that I was talking about. I did notice in my reread of this that this is really plot driven in terms of the way it's written. Now, usually I'm more of a character driven book kind of person, but I think in this case the characters are pretty interesting and have such interesting backstories in terms of what Frank Badoer tried to do to put the new spin on the characters from the Wonderland story, that the characters are so interesting that I don't mind that it's like super plot driven. One thing that I did notice in my reread of this is something to do kind of with the historical elements that are put in this book. Since the last time I had read this book, I actually had watched quite a few documentaries about the creation of Alice in Wonderland and the author and what inspired him to write the book, because I like to watch documentaries on classic lit. Frank Badoer does kind of add some elements that were real life things. For example, Charles Dodson did have like a stutter or a speech impediment, and he put that into the story. Also, I feel like the character of Alice does look quite a bit more like the real Alice Little. Alice Little was the little girl that Charles Dodson kind of wrote Alice in Wonderland for. And those are just like a couple of examples of things that he put in there like that he kind of fictionalized, but they're still kind of there if you look for them. I've always really enjoyed this book and I loved it yet again, so I gave it 5 stars. I found it like extra super fun because I buddy read this with my friend over at Max Washington Songs, and he ended up really liking it, and I've been trying to get somebody else to like this book as much as me. The next book that I completed completed was Memoirs of a Geisha by Arthur Golden. This book is a historical fiction that takes place mostly during the 1930s to the 1940s, and it centers around a character named Nita Sayuri, who is basically telling the story of her life and how she became a geisha. My mom has been recommending this book to me for a very, very long time, and it took me forever to get around to it, but I finally got around to it, and I really, really loved it, so thank you, Mom. Now, a big part of why I enjoyed this book is the main character who narrates the story. I feel like Arthur Golden wrote this character so well. She is a character that you just really get invested in. I was invested in her life. I wanted to know all her thoughts, all her feelings about things. I rooted for her. I wanted to smack people in the face that held her back. Like, I was really invested. And I think that is the main strength of the book. I think if the main character hadn't been as well developed as she is, the book would have kind of been flat, because the actual plot is not like a run, action, excitement kind of plot. It's like a story of people's life, and it is written very much like a memoir, even though it is fictional. So what kind of ties you in is that character. Another thing that I absolutely loved about this book was the writing style. I think the similes and metaphors and just descriptions that were used in this book were ones that I had never seen in any other book. So they were very refreshing and new and really different and beautiful to read. Now, the only thing that I would say about Memoirs of a Geisha is that I personally have not done a ton of research about being a geisha or what geisha life is like, or even like a lot of stuff about cultural things in Japan. So I'm not sure how 100% accurate this book is in terms of all those elements. I do feel like the research was done. I think you can tell the difference between when an author did no research and just wrote something and when an author did do the research. So I do feel like Arthur Golden did do a lot of research, but I don't know how much of what he wrote in here is actually like fiction and how much of it is true, if you get what I'm saying. And I would say there were maybe like one, maybe two places where I did kind of feel like, yeah, this was written by an American guy situation. But it literally just was like one or two like sentences in the book. It wasn't like big chunks of the book. So it didn't deeply take away from my reading of it that stuff like that was in there. I was so invested in the story and the dynamics between all the different characters and what was kind of going on with the experience of the geisha that he was presenting, where I didn't go through it with a fine-tooth comb and like pick out everything, but I'm sure somebody else would. All that being said, as just like finding utter enjoyment in reading something, I gave this book 5 stars. I reread yet another book, and it was So Be It by Sarah Weeks. This is a book about a young girl named Heidi. She has had an unconventional upbringing because her mother is mentally disabled, and so their neighbor, who is agoraphobic, Bernadette, has basically helped them survive in the apartment building where Heidi lives. Because Heidi's mother is mentally disabled, she has a very small vocabulary of words, and one of the words that she uses is something that is quite a bit of a mystery to Heidi, and it kind of starts to haunt Heidi, and she wants to know what it means, and this kind of leads her to go on a cross-country trip to discover what her past is like, because she doesn't know anything about how she came to be, because, you know, her mother couldn't tell her. I was really glad that I gave So Be It a reread, because I feel like the first couple of times that I've read this book, I was more focused on the story, and the story is really good, and I do think it's a really cool story just because it's a contemporary, but it's not following any of the lines that usually contemporary kind of books fit, and it also isn't like a romance book. It's more about like a character journey and like their inner growth. However, this time I did really focus more on the themes that were presented in this book, and it has a really interesting theme, which is there are some things in life that you just can't know unless you were like present. There are many things that are just mysteries in your life, and I think that is a really interesting concept to explore. I also like that it kind of explores a concept that is kind of hard to explain, but it's kind of that the truth can be stranger than fiction, or that there are like strange things in your life that happen that are just kind of unexplained. Like, for example, Heidi in this book has a really lucky streak. She's just like this really lucky person, and it kind of might almost seem unbelievable to people, but I feel like the way it's written in the story, it actually makes a lot of sense. This one is another one that has really cool and kind of different descriptions and things like that because of the way the character has grown up, and I really like how the character is presented and how she goes on this journey. So I really enjoyed rereading this. I think it's one of those short books that kind of says a lot, and I gave this book 5 stars yet again. I did another reread, and this reread was Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt. This is Frank McCourt's memoir that takes place sort of during his life in the 1930s and 40s. So this is basically his childhood and teen years when he was growing up in Ireland, and just like the really tough and crazy experiences that he had during that time of his life. I'm really glad that I finally got to reread this book as an adult. I believe when I first read this book, I was more like a teenager, and I feel like the impact of it was still really strong, but I feel like it was really extra strong to me as an adult, and I did notice some things that I probably wouldn't have noticed as a teenager, so I'm really glad that I got around to reading it as a grown-up. And actually, now that I've read it, I do kind of recommend that you read it as an adult, just because of some of the content that is in the book. Every once in a while, you read a book that you read as a teenager, as an adult, and you're going, oh, I read that at a young age? Huh. And this was kind of one of those. Both times that I read this book, I listened to this book in audiobook, and I highly recommend the audiobook because Frank McCourt read the audiobook, and the way he reads it is so excellent. And also, something that I have mentioned when I talk about this book is that the book is super, super sad. Don't get me wrong, it's super sad, but Frank McCourt manages to write some of the scenes in it with just a tidbit of humor, which I think balances it out quite nicely. I feel like that tone comes through quite a bit when he actually is reading it, and I don't know if it would come through as well if you were like reading it your own self. However, this time I did actually read along occasionally with the book, and I did notice something that was interesting, which is when he has dialogue, he doesn't put it in quotation marks, which I don't know what I would think of that if I was just reading it. In the audiobook, it's obviously not a big deal, but if I was just reading it, that might like irk me a little, but I don't know if that would be something that everybody would feel. I noticed quite a few new things with this book. First of all, I noticed that there is like a really interesting dynamic culturally that you never would think of as American about people in Ireland and how they view different people or people even within their own country. And I found that a really interesting dynamic that I had never really thought about before. I feel like this book will really help you build empathy for people that are in truly like destitute and difficult situations, because that is what he was going through. And the way that people in this book that live in that experience view things like death and food and everything else in a totally different way than we that are like fairly healthy and have enough to eat every day would view these situations. Another cool thing that was actually something I wouldn't have thought of was something that was brought up in the foreword of the book, which is in the audiobook now. It wasn't when I read it the first time, but the foreword in the book actually brings up the point that Frank McCourt wrote this book in present tense as opposed to past tense, so that the reader could really get like the feeling that he felt at the particular ages that he talks about in this. And that is really effective to me in the way that the story is told. You're like there with him, and you're really like getting what he thought and felt at that moment. So I kind of ended up with 2 ratings on this one for my reread. The first one, as an actual book, I probably would rate this like a 4.75 because even though I love it, I do think if I read it actually in print, like the no quotation things would probably grate me a little bit. Really, really love the audiobook, and I would give the audiobook itself just like 5 stars. The last book that I completed in the month of March was The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling. This is a collection of poetry and short stories. Now, the first 3 do center around the character Mowgli, who you might be familiar with from Disney and other things, and it basically centers around him growing up in the jungle, raised by wolves and also other jungle animals, and kind of what happens to him. The final 4 short stories are ones that don't have anything to do with the Mowgli storyline. They are all kind of standalone short stories, but they do center around different animals, and animals being the main characters and their adventures. This was a pretty interesting read, and I have been meaning to read this book for a really long time, but I finally got like fire under my butt to like read it because I, as part of my job, teach musical theater classes, and all the classes that I'm doing are doing musical versions of The Jungle Book. So I wanted to do my research, if you will, and see if there was anything that I wanted to use from there or things that would inspire me in terms of music or blocking or any of that stuff for my things. And I was just researching some stuff with this one, and it was really helpful in that aspect. So one reason that I'm pretty glad that I picked up this book. In terms of the book itself, I, for the most part, felt this to be a really, really relaxing read. Like if I was in the mood to just get in a chill kind of feeling, this was something that I wanted to pick up for that, because it is a very poetical writing style. It is written also in the way of fairy tales and folk tales, if you're familiar with that writing style, where it's not really so focused on character and like feelings and the feelings of the characters, as opposed to being focused on like plot and the lessons learned, and also maybe a little bit of allegory in there. So if you really like that writing style of folk tales or fairy tales, then you probably will enjoy the writing in this. I do enjoy that writing style quite a bit. I have to be in the mood for it, but when I'm in the mood for it, I enjoy it. So that is one thing about this book, was I had to kind of be in the mood for that type of storytelling when I wanted to pick it up. So it did take me a little longer to finish this than it probably should have, considering that it's not very long. But when I was in the mood for it, I was in the mood, and I did enjoy that element. It is a short story book, and I feel like a lot of times when I read short story books, there are at least 1 or 2 short stories that are just sort of alright, like they're kind of meh, and this definitely had that issue. I think there's at least 2 in here that were not bad by any means. They just weren't floating my boat 100%, but that's not really uncommon with short story books for me, so I kind of expected that going in. The other thing that didn't 100% float my boat was the structure of the first 3 Mowgli related stories. They are set up in a very odd way, so even though they're pretty fun to read, if you kind of think about it in hindsight, you go, what was he really trying to do with the layout of these? And I think that element could have been a little better, but it didn't like ruin the book for me or anything. I also kind of wanted to talk about this really lovely edition of the book that I got. So it is one of the Mina Lima interactive illustrated versions. So it has these really cool illustrations that you can like interact with. Some of them actually like pull out like this. There are like cool ones that are in the margins. There's some really nice full page illustrations and things like that. And in terms of looking at this, it is so beautiful to look at and colorful, and it's kind of fun to like pause your reading and like interact with the artistry of the book, and I really enjoyed that. The only thing about this edition is that I noticed, in comparison with a version of the book that I looked up in ebook, is that there is one poem that is missing, which is the very first poem, and I didn't see it in there, so I don't know if they purposely did that, what was going on with that. So just thought I'd let you know that about this edition, but other than that, it is a really lovely one. And as a book, even though I had a few qualms with some of the elements of it, I still ended up pretty much enjoying it, so I gave it 4 stars. I usually don't talk about books that I don't finish, but because this book was on my 2018 to be read list, I thought I would bring up the reasons why I don't plan on finishing it, or the series that it's in, or any of that stuff, just real quick. The book that I kind of started in March and read about 54 pages of was A Long, Long Sleep by Anna Sheehan. It's kind of a reimagining of Sleeping Beauty, science fiction-esque-ish. In the 54 pages that I read, I will say that nothing was truly heinous or terrible. It was just very beige. Like, everything was just okay. Like, I was like, okay, the characters don't bug me, but they're just alright. The writing is kind of, you know, your normal YA kind of writing, which is fine, but it's like you don't want to read that over and over again. It wasn't very, like, innovative or interesting in terms of that. The world building in particular was the main reason why I decided to stop reading it, because I really felt like it wasn't strong or well executed or well expressed, even if it could have gotten better executed later in the story. And that was one of the main reasons that I decided not to complete the book, because this book is not a standalone. It is part of a duology, from what I can tell, which is called the Unicorp series, and I had no interest in reading the second book, and I just didn't feel like wasting my time trying to complete a book that I knew was just going to be okay and maybe like a 3-star or a 2.5-star book. So I guess I'm going to be giving A Long, Long Sleep to Goodwill, because I don't have any interest in reading it, but at least now I know, and I can, like, have space for another book that I actually do want to read. So that was my March reading wrap-up. I hope you guys enjoyed hearing about my thoughts on these books. As usual, I have left the links to all these books in my affiliate links below. I am no longer an Amazon affiliate at the moment, but I do use something called Magic Links so that you guys can get these books off of Book Depository or Barnes & Noble. So definitely check out those links if you're interested in reading these summaries, seeing reviews, getting these books, all that stuff. That is it for today, my fabulous peeps. I will be back super soon with my April TBR, so be sure to check that out when that video goes up, and thank you for watching. Bye!